Well, you can see my presentation is different. Gary has pointed this out. All of us do not have equal talents, but all of us should have an equal opportunity. So here I am. So I think I'm not a procurement expert, okay, but I am an international tax lawyer, all right? And for a long period of time, I have been advocating that in any sort of a trade agreement, you've got to take account of the tax rates that the various countries have. And if you don't do that, you're not going to have fair trade policies, okay? You're just not going to have it. And I think what I'm going to demonstrate to you here in the next few minutes, I know Stephen's going to wrap up and we don't necessarily want to belabor this, is to give you some idea on the various systems of taxation that we have on cross-border transactions, okay? And most of these systems are designed to mitigate the impact of double taxation, right? So if you are a U.S. company and you are engaged in cross-border transactions, in the United States, we have a worldwide system of taxation. In fact, a number of the industrialized countries do have a worldwide taxation system. Now, the reason that they have it is that they want to preclude people from going offshore in order to take advantage of a zero or lower tax rate in a tax haven. Now, that's the premise, except it doesn't work very well in reality, as we're going to see. Now, we've got, so most of the international transaction issues are designed to mitigate double taxation. Now, the United States mitigates double taxation through the so-called foreign tax credit, right? And the system that we use there is, and countries like France and the Netherlands use the exemption method, okay? The exemption method basically says once you go beyond your borders and you're doing business income, we're going to cede jurisdiction to the source country. So, for example, if a French company goes to the UK, we're going to let the UK tax that, and we're not going to tax that at all. So that's a mitigation effect of double taxation. Now, this method is kind of like my hairstyle, and this method is like Gary's hairstyle, okay, which is a lot different, okay? More complicated, all right? Because mine's simple. I don't have to do anything in the morning. Just go to the shower and I'm out, okay? So the foreign tax credit method is quite complicated, but essentially we know that if a U.S. company comes into another country, it's going to be taxed because the source of the income is derived in that country. We also have the home country also taxes you, right? The United States. So to mitigate the double taxation, we've used the concept of the foreign tax credits. You could get a dollar for dollar credit against that tax that you pay in the U.S. Now, so how do American companies take advantage of tax holiday countries such as Cyprus? Right now they may not be taking advantage of it too much. How do they take advantage of Ireland? Okay, well, the methodology, which is the question I was asking you, is to basically form a wholly owned subsidiary in a low tax country, okay? And I'll give you an example of something that I've just worked on here just recently, because I do have a side tax practice that I work with some people in the Kansas City area. And here is a U.S. company, okay? Now this happens to be an LLC, and an LLC in the United States is a limited liability company, okay? You can choose to tax that either as a corporation or as a partnership. In this case, these people have chosen to tax it as a partnership. So therefore, the income passes through to the partners, okay? And right now, our highest tax rate is roughly 39%, but it depends upon your tax rate when it goes through to them, okay? This company has been trying to penetrate the European market. And the first thing you do when you try to penetrate a market is you work through independent distributors, okay? Because if you structure it right, you're not going to be subject to taxation in that source country, right? because of the rules either by treaty, which basically by treaty, in order to be taxed by the source country, if the country that you're working with has a treaty, you have to have, quotes, a permanent establishment, which is a fixed place of business, okay? So if you use independent distributors, you can avoid having a permanent establishment. So that's usually the first way in which they penetrate a market. Okay, so this company was not having success with independent distributors. So they say, we want to have a permanent fixture in Europe and to have our own employees who could crack that market. The reason they were not having success with the independent distributors is they were pushing the other products. They wanted their own captive supplier to push the products. So here's was the recommendation. Okay, Cyprus. Now, we did this 3 or 4 months ago. It was a recommendation. I'm not sure we'd recommend it now, okay? All right, Cyprus has a 10% corporate tax rate, but since 2012, it has a 2% rate if you transfer your IP rights to Cyprus, okay? So this can be set up as a foreign sub, and then if we want to penetrate into other markets, we can set up companies here for those particular markets in Europe, okay? Under US tax law, we're going to treat them as a branch, because we can do that under the so-called check the box rules. So that essentially the income of these from a US tax standpoint will be attributable to Cyprus, okay? They can also be attributable to Cyprus under its rules. So the upshot of it is, if I'm making a market penetration for, say, public procurement, okay, if I structure it right, I'm saying, okay, let's assume it's for services. Well, the source rule on services in most jurisdictions is where are the services performed. Okay, so if I perform my service in Cyprus, or I could even maybe perform in the Grand Cayman Islands, okay, there will be that income over here will not be income of the place that is basically paying the services. And I remember I had a student one time that told me, he says, we paid some French official to assist us in selling some of our arms to the French police. It was a broker. He said, we paid with US funds. That's US source income, isn't it? I said, no, that's not US source income, because it's not the payment where the payment comes from. It's a service, and usually under most source rules, it is where the services are performed. So I can structure the arrangement to have the services performed offshore. Now, if I'm doing that in public procurement law, let me ask this question. The fact that if I gave it to somebody domestically, there would be a tax on that services, which would then go back to the government, right? But not here. The tax is not taxed because it's the contacts of services are performed offshore. I can do the same with goods. Most cases, it depends upon where title passes for the goods. So the same thing can happen. So let me ask this simple question. Is it fair to the local people, from a fair price standpoint, because of the loss of the government revenue for not having the income being generated by the domestic person, compared to having the income being passed offshore? So I think that's the key thing that I don't think people are thinking about here, okay? Because maybe we ought to have a rule. And I don't, this is a real problem, but at least the person has to, in computing the determination of the fair price, if the domestic supplier gets the bid, then obviously we can factor in the tax rate. If somebody undercuts them, but is in a tax haven jurisdiction. And the reason they have undercut them is because their tax rate is 0. Okay? If that's true, then maybe in determining fair price to the bidders, that has to be taken into account. Because the government may be, from a cost-benefit analysis, may be losing more money than they ultimately get, or than they've paid out. So I think that's the point. Now, has that been considered at all in the EU?
No, I mean, we have provisions in the EU legislation that deals with abnormally low prices, which is a system that, as it is formulated at the moment, doesn't work very well. I mean, to be quite honest. And one of the things that is under in the proposal I referred to is a by element or small element of that proposal is trying to even reinforce that, but it's incredibly difficult to deal with, and I don't think that has ever really looked at the tax angle.
Yeah.
It's more direct subsidies that are supporting, or in some
Try to attract business, right? Well, now Missouri legislation is doing the same. So this whole thing is absolutely nutso, okay? To me, we're not going to have fair trade in this country and in this world unless you start addressing a uniform system of taxation. It's got to be part of the WTO. It's got to be part of the GPA. And if you don't do that, you're always going to have market distortions. There's just no question about it. Why do U.S. companies form in Ireland? Well, everybody knows that reason. The same is true when they form in Cyprus. I mean, it's just not, I mean, I just think if you keep doing this, it's going to mean that, you're going to have more loss of revenue to the governments again and again and again. And I don't think people realize how significant this issue is. I think it's very significant.
We're not comparing on a comparable basis, and we're not getting value for money necessarily.
Yes, exactly. That's my point.
And there's no way that I've ever seen in the evaluation criteria where that is taken into account to bring people to a comparable basis. And if we're going for best value, the best value proposition might be someone who's higher that is paying taxes back to the government.
Exactly. And I think that's the point I'm trying to make. So you have somebody who's bidding, who's local for say in Wales, they're local in Wales, okay? They have to factor in their tax burden, right? Somebody offshore, for example, coming from a Cyprus foreign subsidiary of a U.S. bidder, does not have to. I mean, they can undercut that person. That is just not a fair policy. I feel very, very strongly about it. And I think what has happened is we ought not to be making decisions on fair trade policies without considering, I mean, the EU has got it right with the 4 freedoms, at least to start. NAFTA is, I think, kind of a disaster because we look at the immigration problem we have in the U.S. today, okay? And because we got this incredibly restrictive policy in terms of free movement of workers in North America, right? And you've got, and the WTO, what do you have? Well, basically, it's more free movement of goods and services, and not so much with free movement of labor, and not so much with free movement of other items. So I think that's the key issue that I wanted to raise here today. So, Stephen, any questions real quick here?
I'm good.
He's good.
You're about to give me the floor anyway.
Well, I just want to know, I think everybody, I hope that people understand how this issue is impacted. And I think the point is that there is a number of bidders of public services that are basically not necessarily, they may be EU in the sense that they have a subsidiary here, but they're not necessarily with respect to their parent, okay? All right, thanks, I appreciate it. Are there any questions, anyone here?
Questions?
Probably not on tax issues, let's see.
No, not tax issues. I just wish we had more of your time because I think that could be a big problem.
So there's your new grant, Gary. I'll be your consultant. We'll come over. Stephen and I'll come over, right? You do the procurement part.
Bring and yeah, we're all in. This could generate huge amount of money across the EU or save huge amount of money, whichever way you want to roll the dice, basically. But yeah, I don't know if this has been thought of in that much detail. And
well, I tell you how I got interested in this initially because about 2 years ago I got a contact from a business journal in the United States. Garment Industries. Everybody heard of the GPS garment industry? Well, a reporter said, well, they're only paying 12 or I think 11% on their worldwide income, okay? Now, the reason they were doing that is they're originally, there's a fellow from Taiwan and another man from America that formed this country, or formed this company. Most of their manufacturing was done in Asia, right? But they set up their parent company in the Grand Cayman Islands. Okay, that's where the parent was. And then they would cherry pick where they would set up their subsidiaries, right? And, you know, if you think about that, an overall 12% tax rate, okay? Well, if you continually have people like me who can figure a way to get around the rules, what you need, I mean, legally, I mean, I'm not talking about illegally, it's legal the way you do it. You've got to come up with a uniform system. Now, we have a semblance of a uniform system in the state area. It's called UDIPTA, which is the Uniform Distribution of Income for Tax Act, okay? Now, not all states have joined it, but that basically is a way to mitigate double taxation, et cetera. Nothing really has worked, though, to harmonize the tax rates. I know EU is trying to get these companies to harmonize it, but, you know, they've done things like knock off the special status companies designed to export. That's considered illegal under the EU, but not these overall harmonization of tax rates. Okay, I'm up. Stephen, you.